In a recent monologue, a prominent late-night television host took aim at a significant shift in trade policy that had been dominating headlines. The segment began with sharp commentary on the sudden announcement of a 90-day pause in the rollout of new tariffs, a decision that caught many off guard. The host drew parallels between this move and the behavior of someone making impulsive decisions at a roulette table, using humor to spotlight what was perceived as inconsistency and a lack of clear economic foresight. The television personality didn't hold back when dissecting the announcement's timing and messaging. He pointed out that just weeks earlier, there had been strong rhetoric from the administration emphasizing the necessity and urgency of these tariffs. They were presented as critical tools to combat foreign economic practices deemed harmful to domestic industries. Yet now, without warning, the very same measures were being shelved temporarily with no detailed explanation beyond vague references to negotiation space and market stability. This dramatic pivot became the centerpiece of the host's comedic critique. He walked the audience through the timeline of the policy's introduction and subsequent reversal, underscoring what he saw as a contradiction between tough trade talk and a sudden retreat. The juxtaposition provided ample fodder for satire, with the comedian suggesting that the policy shift was less a strategic decision and more an act of improvisation. The sketch incorporated clips of previous public statements that championed the tariffs as essential to economic justice and restoring balance in international trade. These were contrasted with the more recent language used to justify the pause, language that appeared more conciliatory and uncertain. The host used this shift in tone as a springboard to question whether there was any coherent long-term plan, or if decisions were being made based on optics and political pressure rather than sound economic rationale. Another major point of criticism revolved around the effect this announcement had on the stock market and global trade relationships. The host noted that markets had already begun to react to the initial tariff rollout, with fluctuations in major indices and signs of concern among multinational corporations. The pause, instead of calming markets, seemed to introduce a new layer of unpredictability. The comedic commentary highlighted the frustration felt by investors and business leaders who were now left to interpret whether this delay signaled a reconsideration of the policy or merely a tactical pause in an ongoing standoff. Audience laughter was frequently punctuated with moments of pointed commentary, reflecting a broader concern about transparency and consistency in governance. The host used irony to illustrate how economic policies with such far-reaching implications were being handled in a manner that seemed, at times, reactive rather than reflective. He imagined hypothetical conversations within the administration that mirrored the chaos of a brainstorming session without a whiteboard, ideas thrown around with no clear structure or follow-through. Perhaps the most biting part of the segment came when the host introduced mock graphics and charts, playfully, labeled with terms like tariff roulette and the wheel of fiscal fortune. These visual gags served to emphasize the idea that the nation's economic direction was being decided not through careful policy analysis, but via spur-of-the-moment decisions that changed with the political winds. The sketches combined humor and skepticism in a way that resonated with a live audience clearly attuned to the underlying concerns. While the segment was built on comedy, it unmistakably carried a deeper critique. The host's tone suggested a belief that trade policy, a cornerstone of economic strategy, deserved more consistency and clarity than what was being offered. Through satire, he underscored the anxiety many feel about the consequences of abrupt policy changes, particularly when those changes affect businesses, consumers, and international relations in real time. The performance ultimately drew attention to the tension between political messaging and economic action. It suggested that, when those two elements are out of sync, public trust can erode. The laughter in the room wasn't just a reaction to clever jokes, it was also an expression of unease with the unpredictability of current leadership decisions on key economic issues. The host served as a mouthpiece for those who view the situation, not only with amusement but also with apprehension about what might come next. In response to the backlash surrounding the decision to delay a significant tariff implementation, a prominent political figure from the administration took the stage to offer a staunch defense of the policy. With unwavering conviction, she reframed the controversial measure not as a burden, but as a benefit, boldly claiming that tariffs function as a form of tax relief for American citizens. Her remarks, delivered with sharp confidence, aimed to flip the script on the conventional narrative that tariffs are economically harmful. Instead, she positioned them as strategic instruments to protect American industry and restore balance in trade relationships that had, in her view, long been tilted against the United States. Her defense centered on the idea that for decades, foreign competitors had taken advantage of lenient trade policies, flooding the American market with cheap goods produced under unfair labor practices and lax environmental standards. She painted a picture of hard-working American manufacturers struggling to compete with artificially low prices and called for a reassertion of economic sovereignty. According to her, tariffs were not about isolationism or economic aggression, but rather about fairness and reciprocity. They were, in essence, a way to level the playing field, to ensure that American products had a fighting chance at home and abroad. She argued that when foreign producers face tariffs, the playing field begins to shift in favor of domestic manufacturers. This, in her framing, was tantamount to a tax break for Americans. She claimed that as domestic industries regained their footing and expanded production, job opportunities would multiply, wages would rise, and communities once hollowed out by outsourcing would begin to thrive again. Her words tapped into a deeply rooted sentiment of economic nationalism, a belief that the country's strength is directly tied to the vitality of its industrial base. Throughout her speech, she made deliberate use of populist language, referring to the forgotten men and women of American industry. She evoked images of small-town factory workers and middle-class families whose livelihoods had been compromised by the offshoring of production. According to her, these communities had waited long enough for relief, and tariffs were part of a broader effort to finally deliver it. She dismissed concerns from elite economists and media figures who warned of consumer price hikes, portraying them as out of touch with the real challenges facing ordinary Americans. She also tackled the criticism head-on that tariffs would lead to higher costs for goods and services. In her view, short-term adjustments in prices were a small price to pay for long-term economic independence. She cited examples of industries that had already benefited from prior tariffs, suggesting that similar results could be replicated on a broader scale. She presented data, some contested by critics, that purported to show increased factory openings and investments in areas previously ravaged by industrial decline. This, she argued, was evidence that the approach was already working. In making her case, she also took a defiant tone against global critics and international institutions that had denounced the move. She framed their objections as predictable resistance from those who had long profited from the status quo. She questioned why Americans should take cues from nations that had, in her words, built their economic success on the back of American consumption without offering fair access to their own markets. This nationalist appeal struck a chord with many in her base who have grown skeptical of globalization and foreign influence over domestic policy. Notably, her remarks weren't limited to defending past decisions. They laid the groundwork for future actions. She hinted at an even more aggressive trade posture to come, suggesting that additional tariffs might be on the table if foreign governments failed to engage in what she called genuine, balanced negotiations. Her message was clear. The administration was prepared to stand its ground, even in the face of diplomatic friction or economic turbulence, if it meant defending American workers. As she concluded, she reiterated her central message: tariffs were not a tax on the American people, but a tax on those who sought to undermine them. By shifting the burden onto foreign exporters, she argued, the policy ensured that economic leverage remained in American hands. Her delivery was combative, unapologetic, and deeply rooted in a worldview that saw international trade not as a neutral arena, but as a battlefield where only the strong survive. The claim that tariffs act as tax cuts for American citizens quickly drew significant scrutiny from economic experts and policy analysts across the political spectrum. In a swift and pointed response, numerous economists stepped forward to challenge this assertion, presenting decades of empirical evidence and economic theory that suggested the opposite is true. Their critiques were not just academic. They were grounded in real-world implications for everyday American consumers and businesses. According to these experts, tariffs function fundamentally as import taxes. When a tariff is imposed on a foreign product, the cost of that product increases for U.S. importers. In turn, those importers often pass along that added cost to retailers, who then transfer it to consumers. As a result, rather than acting as a financial benefit for Americans, tariffs often result in higher prices on goods ranging from electronics and automobiles to household necessities and clothing. The consensus among economists was clear. Labeling tariffs as tax cuts ignores the chain of cost increases that ultimately affect the consumer. This reaction wasn't new or partisan. It reflected a long-held understanding within the economic community. Many experts cited previous rounds of tariffs and trade disputes as cautionary examples. When similar measures were enacted in the past, they led to price surges, retaliatory tariffs from other nations, and disruptions to supply chains. American farmers, manufacturers, and small businesses frequently bore the brunt of these consequences, often finding their exports penalized by foreign governments or facing shortages of critical components needed for production. One particular concern, voiced by several analysts, was the disproportionate impact on low- and middle-income households. These families spend a larger percentage of their income on goods that are subject to tariffs. When prices rise due to import taxes, the effect on their budgets can be immediate and significant. Economists warned that these costs, though subtle at first, accumulate over time and can lead to diminished purchasing power and increased financial strain, particularly in regions already facing. Another argument made by economists revolved around the long-term competitiveness of American businesses. While tariffs might offer short-term protection to certain domestic industries, they can also stifle innovation and efficiency by reducing the incentive to modernize or cut costs. Shielded from foreign competition, some industries may become complacent, leading to lower productivity and a diminished capacity to compete globally in the future. Analysts argued that rather than encouraging growth, excessive reliance on tariffs could trap industries in a cycle of dependency and stagnation. Some critics went further, suggesting that the claim about tariffs being tax cuts was not just incorrect, but deliberately misleading. They emphasized that political rhetoric often repackages complex economic tools in ways that are more palatable to the public, but ultimately distort the underlying facts. In this case, what was being described as a financial relief measure was, in practice, a policy that shifted the financial burden to American consumers and businesses, especially those dependent on imported goods for resale or production. Academic institutions and think tanks began releasing updated reports and economics models to demonstrate the potential fallout from widespread tariff usage. These models predicted price increases in key sectors, projected job losses in industries affected by retaliatory tariffs, and suggested slower GDP growth in scenarios where trade barriers were escalated. Their research also pointed out that trade wars tend to create uncertainty, which can cause businesses to delay investments, hiring, and expansion plans, further dampening economic momentum. The pushback wasn't limited to economists in the ivory tower. Business leaders across multiple sectors joined the conversation, echoing concerns about rising costs and international retaliation. Retail associations warned that tariffs on everyday products would inevitably be passed down to shoppers. Agricultural groups feared losing access to vital export markets, particularly as other nations sought out alternative suppliers. Manufacturing coalitions expressed anxiety about securing raw materials and components essential to their operations. Together, these voices formed a coherent and forceful rebuttal to the idea that tariffs offer economic relief. Their arguments were rooted in practical experience, data-driven analysis, and a long history of observing how protectionist policies play out in complex global economies. They urged policymakers and the public alike to recognize the true nature of tariffs, not as financial gifts, but as tools that, while sometimes strategically useful, carry serious costs and consequences that must be acknowledged and carefully weighed. The heated exchange between a prominent administration spokesperson and a well-known television personality has sparked a broader and increasingly intense public debate over the nation's tariff policy. What began as a clash of rhetoric quickly evolved into a national conversation, drawing in economists, political analysts, business leaders, and ordinary citizens. At the heart of this debate lies a fundamental question. Are tariffs a tool for economic empowerment, or are they instruments of self-inflicted harm? In defending the administration's approach, supporters have emphasized the need to recalibrate global trade dynamics that they argue have long been unfairly tilted against the country. They portray tariffs as a corrective measure, one that puts pressure on foreign governments to open their markets, reform exploitative practices, and treat domestic industries with greater respect. These voices argue that trade has not been truly free for years, citing subsidized foreign goods, currency manipulation, and one-sided trade agreements as long-standing issues that have undermined domestic manufacturing and job security. Opponents, however, are not convinced. They argue that while the intent behind the policy may be to defend national interests, its execution has been erratic and lacking in a cohesive long-term strategy. The abrupt announcement of a pause in the planned tariff rollout only deepened these concerns. For critics, this sudden reversal was emblematic of a broader pattern of unpredictability, an approach to trade that is reactive rather than strategic, guided more by political optics than by careful economic planning. The business community has been particularly vocal in its response. Many industries, especially those heavily reliant on international supply chains, voiced frustration at the constant back and forth over trade rules. Uncertainty, they argue, is the enemy of growth. When companies cannot anticipate policy changes or trust that existing rules will be upheld, they become reluctant to invest, expand operations, or hire new workers. Several corporate leaders reported delaying major decisions due to the lack of clarity around tariff enforcement and potential retaliatory measures from foreign markets. Meanwhile, trade associations and lobbying groups have launched campaigns to either support or challenge the policy, reflecting the deep division within the business world. Domestic manufacturers and industries protected by tariffs have largely been supportive, citing increased demand and reduced foreign competition. However, importers, retailers, and exporters warn that these benefits are uneven and may come at the cost of higher prices, reduced consumer choice, and fractured international relationships. Public sentiment on the issue remains split. Some citizens, particularly those in manufacturing regions, have welcomed the renewed focus on protecting domestic jobs and industries. They view tariffs as a way to push back against decades of economics policy that favored globalization at the expense of local workers. For them, the rhetoric around reclaiming economic sovereignty resonates deeply, especially in communities that have long felt neglected or left behind. Others, however, are more skeptical. Consumers concerned about rising prices, farmers worried about access to foreign markets, and younger voters with global perspectives question whether this approach to trade is sustainable. They express concern that the country may be isolating itself at a time when international cooperation is more critical than ever. For these individuals, the emphasis should be on building smarter trade partnerships, investing in innovation, and ensuring that domestic industries are competitive on their own merit, not through the protection of tariffs. Media coverage of the debate has added fuel to the fire. Editorials, opinion pieces, and televised panel discussions have dissected every angle of the policy, from its short-term impacts on inflation to its long-term implications for global alliances. Commentators have debated whether the current administration is engaging in a tactical reset or simply navigating a series of missteps. The sudden shift in tone from aggressive enforcement to a more cautious pause has led to speculation about internal disagreements, pressure from influential business interests, or mounting concerns about the economic consequences of overreach. In legislative circles, the conversation has grown more urgent. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are weighing in, some calling for oversight, others proposing new frameworks to guide future trade decisions. The growing demand for transparency and accountability reflects a desire to ensure that such impactful policies are not crafted behind closed doors or subject to sudden reversals. Some have even introduced legislation aimed at curbing the executive branch's unilateral ability to impose tariffs, signaling a push toward rebalancing trade authority. As the debate continues, what's clear is that the issue of tariffs has transcended its economic roots to become a cultural and political touchstone. It's no longer just about trade deficits or market access. It's about identity, power, and the future direction of the country's role in the global economy. This national conversation shows no signs of slowing down as stakeholders from every corner continue to weigh in, each offering a vision of what they believe true economic strength looks like. As the public debate over tariffs unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that this issue is about more than just numbers on a balance sheet. It's about the identity of a nation, its values, and how it chooses to interact with a rapidly changing global economy. The conversation has exposed sharp divides, not only between political camps, but also within industries, communities, and even households. While one side views tariffs as a necessary course correction in a system that has long disadvantaged domestic workers, the other sees them as a blunt instrument that risks undermining economic stability and alienating key international partners. The heart of the matter lies a tension between two competing visions. One that champions economic protectionism as a pathway to national revival, and another that favors open markets and global cooperation as keys to prosperity. Neither perspective can be dismissed outright. Both are rooted in genuine concerns, whether it's the loss of manufacturing jobs or the rising cost of living for working families. And it's precisely this complexity that makes the tariff debate so enduring and consequential. What's become increasingly evident is the need for greater transparency and a more deliberate, informed approach to trade policy. Sudden shifts in direction, such as the unexpected pause in tariff enforcement, only add to the uncertainty faced by businesses, workers, and consumers alike. They create ripple effects that extend beyond the economy, sowing doubt in institutions and leadership at a time when public confidence is already strained. Economic policy, particularly one as powerful and far-reaching as trade tariffs, must be grounded in both strategy and empathy. It must acknowledge the hardships faced by those displaced in a globalized economy, while also embracing innovation and competitiveness as essential drivers of long-term growth. Solutions rooted in polarization, sound bites, or oversimplified slogans are not enough. What's needed is a dialogue that respects nuance, welcomes expert input, and balances immediate needs with future vision. As the conversation continues in media, on the floor of Congress, and around kitchen tables across the country, the path forward remains uncertain. But what's clear is that Americans are engaged, asking questions, challenging narratives, and seeking answers. This engagement is not just healthy, it's necessary. Because in the end, economic policy is not just about trade, it's about people, their jobs, their security, their dignity, and their hope for a better future. Whether tariffs will ultimately prove to be a successful tool or a costly misstep remains to be seen. But the national reckoning they've sparked is already shaping the next chapter of how the country defines its economic strength and global position. And in that sense, the conversation itself is a vital step toward clarity, accountability, and a more thoughtful approach to policymaking in an increasingly